So, for our first lecture on civilizations, we're going back. Way, way back in time. And we have to acknowledge when we look at migrations that for about 95% of the time Homo sapiens have been on Earth, we've mainly been hunter gatherers. Now, Homo sapiens emerged 200 to 250,000 years ago in the grasslands and plateaus of eastern and southern Africa, and first made their way out about 100,000 years ago, just give or take. Compared to the rest of human life, such as when what we call civilizations appeared, they made little progress. But compared to other animals, humans made tremendous progress. Now you can see that gatherers is bolded because by and large, these humans gathered berries and ate wild vegetables as part of their primary diet. They rarely ate meat because hunts were often unsuccessful, so it's theorized that meat might have been reserved for feasts, and this time frame is sometimes referred to as the Paleolithic era. Now, there hasn't been as much in the way of archaeology in Africa as in the rest of the world, but we do know that this is about the time frame when early humans began to adapt to new environments, such as forests and deserts. Now, to do so, they're going to utilize tools like axes with stone blades. They're going to have tools made out of bone and nets and rafts for fishing. The shift from scavenging dead animals to actively hunting live animals and catching live fish with tools they created is a huge change in human history. Now, the biggest game changer of them all is fire. And it's unclear exactly when mankind began to utilize fire, but it was probably, a million years or so ago. Archaeology indicates that about 18,000 years ago, clay pots came into use in East Asia. So this indicates that this is about when fire was utilized for the purpose of cooking. Now, it was already used for its smoke, to scare animals off cliffs during hunts, and for light. But cooking made food easier to digest, and it was healthier for humans. It also means that if food is easier to digest, fewer muscles are devoted to chewing and digesting food, so more energy is devoted to brain power. So in terms of when humans migrated, they made their way to the Middle East and Asia first, as you can see out of the map, emerging from Eastern Africa. Then, at about the same time, they made it to Australia and Europe, followed by North America, South America, and then New Zealand and the Pacific Islands only a couple thousand years ago. At some point, and obviously this is clear because we have travels taking place on water, boats were innovated for their journeys. So humans are traversing water as well as land. So we've ultimately always been on the move, so to speak. Now, in terms of the societies of these peoples on the move, Paleolithic or Stone Age, Old Stone Age society, they can be classified by their small yet intimate groups. Now, what were called kinship groups had about 20 to 50 people, and the numbers might have intentionally been kept small because it would be really difficult to carry multiple children at the same time. It would also be to the advantage of these groups to keep the numbers small because they didn't want to exhaust all the resources of an area too quickly. So multiple kinship groups would have banded together to form clans, and multiple clans would have formed tribes. And nobody really needs to be related within these groups. However, that doesn't say there wasn't intermarriage among tribes and clans, because there were. And there was trade between these groups, and larger groups would most likely have come together for religious or spiritual purposes. So in terms of dividing labor, the traditional explanation has been that men went out on hunts while women raised children and gathered berries and vegetables. To a degree, this has been called into question, but the basic division is probably true. Men took charge of hunts, did a lot of the heavy lifting, and engaged in early forms of warfare, while women took charge of the gathering and might have even breastfed their children for up to 5 years. There's also evidence that gathering was a task both genders took part in. and child rearing was actually the responsibility of both genders, leading to the conclusion that foraging societies are much more egalitarian or equal than the societies that followed. So part of this is due to a study of the modern San people of southern Africa, which found that women accounted for about 70% of the diet via gathering versus the 30% of their diet that came from meats collected on hunts. The egalitarian nature of life also means that everyone pretty much has the same skill set. So there were few differences in terms of what we might today call class. The mobile nature of these groups also meant that there really isn't room for material possessions, so wealth kind of wasn't a thing. So over time, common language will develop and provide a means of effective communication beyond just simple gestures. Humans are able to survive and adapt to new environments through the notion of shared human experiences. Now, this concept refers to knowledge that's passed down through the generations to ensure survival of immediate family, kinship groups, and, by extension, the human race as a whole. Now, some examples of this include naming plants and animals to distinguish between what's safe and unsafe, as well as where to find them. There's knowledge passed down about parenting and child rearing, and they also pass down knowledge of safety issues such as guarding camp. Communication and language also led to shared ideas, and this helps explain the origin stories for things like thunder and floods, along with common cultural characteristics. So this kind of helps explain how societies were structured. Now, when it comes to belief and change, early evidence indicates that faith was of deep importance to the earliest humans, to the point where the archaeology of caves that early humans lived in indicates special sections reserved for religious ceremonies. Since their society was egalitarian in nature, there were no religious or priestly classes, so part-time shamans existed to perform rituals when necessary. Now, sometimes these shamans would enter a trance to perform the rituals, and drugs are sometimes used to induce this state. Now, it's really hard to pin down exactly what the faiths of these people were, but there's a variety of ideas based on linguistic evidence from ancient Africa. What appears to be the most common beliefs were the cyclical nature of life. These are the systems that emphasize the cycle of birth and renewal that gave it a recurring feel, as opposed to the more linear nature of later monotheistic religions. Think about the cycle of seasons, maybe the worship of the moon and the sun, or perhaps deities or gods acting through elements of nature as examples of this. So archaeologists agree, as we've seen, that these societies ate a plant-based diet because of the struggles with catching meat. So this means that foraging groups had more free time than later agrarian or farming societies because they took care of all their necessary tasks in about 4 to 6 hours per day compared to about 8 or 9 for farming communities. This means they have more time to spend with each other, and they often would spend it around a campfire telling stories, sharing this knowledge. Their diets are also much more varied and healthier, and more exercise is involved in their daily life. Now, the catch is that life expectancy was much shorter. About 21 to 37 years of age is the average life expectancy of a forager, while today the average life expectancy is about 66 years, but we know that advances in medicine have also affected this. There's a lot of evidence of violence during this time, and those who couldn't keep up with the activities of kinship groups are simply left behind. Now, more time also meant more opportunities for trade and communication, as well as chances to share the aforementioned spiritual ideas. These exchanges are the primary ideas behind the two images that you see. On the left, we have Göbekli Tepe, which is in modern-day Turkey, and then Stonehenge in England. Now, Stonehenge is much more well-known, and it's a big-time tourist attraction. It's built in multiple phases from about 3100 BC to 1600 BC. So its construction occurred after what's called the Neolithic revolution was underway. However, its nature suggests that it was built for spiritual purposes, since elements of Stonehenge align perfectly with the winter and summer solstices. Now, Göbekli Tepe, it was inhabited from about 9500 to 8000 BC. So this represents the transition from a foraging to an agrarian way of life. Now, previously, it was thought that nomads would use the site as needed, but recent evidence suggests that the structures were permanent. There was a water supply, there were tools, and there were also massive megaliths, not dissimilar to Stonehenge. It's one of the oldest permanently inhabited settlements in the world. So a lot of time is going by, but we are beginning to transition to a more settled way of life.